When church leaders hear the word security, they often think about cameras, locks, security teams, or emergency response. But some of the greatest threats to a church's mission may never come through the front door. They can come through outdated policies, unclear governance, poorly written agreements, inadequate child protection measures, or decisions that expose the church to unnecessary legal risk. Today, we're talking about how churches can protect the mission before a legal problem becomes a ministry crisis. I want to welcome you to the Faith Secure podcast, where we are watchful, prayerful, and prepared. I'm your host, Dr. Michael Brown, and I'm excited. Today's guest is Matthew Brown, Esquire, Senior Associate at Bay and Mays Attorneys at Law. Matthew works with churches, ministries, and nonprofit organizations to help their leaders navigate legal and governance issues so they can pursue their missions with greater clarity and confidence. His practice includes nonprofit governance, fiduciary responsibilities, bylaws and policies, child protection practices, contracts, facility use agreements, employee and volunteer matters, regulatory compliance, and intellectual property protection. What particularly caught my attention about Matthew's approach is that he doesn't simply help organizations respond when something goes wrong. He helps leaders identify operational risks before they become crises. Matthew Brown, I want to welcome you to the Faith Secure podcast, sir.
Thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to it.
Oh, no problem. You ready to dive right in?
Let's go.
All right, let's do it. Let's start with the legal side of church preparedness. Now, Matthew, I'm going to start broadly. So here's the question. When you begin working with the church, what are some of the legal or governance vulnerabilities you commonly discover that church leaders may not even realize exist?
I mean, I think it just depends on the client. I think it was Eisenhower who said, the biggest danger is not what we know we don't know, but we don't know that we don't know. So yes. Kind of just going through with the client of what they understand the issue might be, diving into their documents, diving into where they're at with their programs, with their governance and everything, and pulling out those things that they might not have understood. And that can be anywhere across the board. It can be inconsistent bylaws, outdated bylaws. It can be outdated policies. It can be different missed filings and other compliance requirements that they just may not have known that they needed. It could have been contracts that are written for one transaction, but really it's, the parties think it's something completely different.
Right.
So just going through those documents, talking to the client, and helping them identify the areas that either they know they don't know and they need some guidance on, or that they didn't even see coming.
Okay. Well, now, having said all that, and thank you, you got all that in. That was a mouthful. Thank you. Now, why do you think churches, now I know the answer to this, but I want the viewers to know, why do you think churches sometimes postpone addressing governance and legal risk issues until a problem arises?
I mean, there's a couple different reasons, but I think the primary one is lack of resources. You either don't have enough time, don't have enough money. And a lot of times you don't have the money to hire people who then don't have the time. So it's kind of that circular reasoning there. But a lot of times we're so focused on the programs, especially for churches. We're so focused on the ministry and on Sunday and our kids programs and our weekly programs and being out in the community, that a lot of times the internal stuff, that back office stuff, gets overlooked. And, we have the nasty word of overhead in the church and nonprofit sector right now that I don't think it should be that much, because overhead is still all part of the programs. You still got to understand the facilities. You still got to have proper governance. You still need to do all of that back end stuff is all critical to the programs.
Right.
So that we can't separate them. But yet sometimes in our heads, we think we're doing the outward stuff. We're making an impact when really the other stuff is the impact too. We're just, it's not correlating. So lack of resources and overly focused on outward programs are the two main reasons, I would say.
Okay. You mentioned the word, Matthew, governance, and I want to dig a little deeper into that. Okay. I know governance is who actually has the authority. So I want to talk about church governance can become complicated because you have pastors, you have boards, you have trustees, you have elders, deacons, committees, and denominational structures that are all involved in decision making.
Yeah.
Why is clearly defining authority and responsibility so important?
I think it comes down to ownership and stewardship. And so whoever has the authority knows that they are responsible for that area, whether that be the church's board, whatever that go by, whether it's board of trustees, board of elders, board of deacons, whatever you call it. That legal board has fiduciary duties. They've got responsibilities for leading the organization, and then identifying what in a church we may consider the officers, whether that be the senior pastor, the treasurer, the secretary, whoever's holding those leadership roles. Need to understand what those roles are and what that responsibility is. And so clearly defining who has the authority in certain areas helps that person take ownership of it. You can't pass the buck on to somebody else saying, I thought that was their responsibility.
Right.
It's you taking the responsibility and taking the ownership of that task and seeing it through.
Okay. And you mentioned about establishing clarity, and I want to talk about that a little bit. So this question is going to be two-part. What role should bylaws play in establishing that clarity, and what problems can arise when bylaws haven't been reviewed or updated for many years?
Yeah, bylaws are great because the law establishes kind of a default set of rules, and they're very high level. It's not necessary. It's very generic as well because they're written for generally nonprofits as a whole, not specific organizations, and especially not specific churches.
Okay.
And so the bylaws help establish who the legal board is, what that role might be, if the church has numerous committees, what those committees' relationships are both to each other and to the board, and what authorities they have and what their scope is. And it also defines the officers. So do you have a senior pastor? Do you have another kind of executive pastor who has some sort of officer type of role, who's responsible for the finances as the treasurer? Or other similar role like that. And nonprofits and churches have flexibility within the law, but they have general flexibility of defining how they want to structure their organization to best fit their needs and their programs. And they do that through their bylaws. And so you mentioned, outdated bylaws and stuff like that. And so if your bylaws were written 25 years ago for a very, committee-centric organization, or like say you started up, like I see this a lot with nonprofits. You start up, you've got your initial 3 or 4 directors that you need.
Right.
And, the bylaws are written for a small startup organization. Now, 25 years later, you're a larger organization. You've got, the 3 or 4 directors can't handle all of the governance for the current organization. You've got committees that didn't exist back 25 years ago. And so being able to go in and revise the bylaws to keep that clarity. And then even on the flip side, maybe you were that big organization and now you've streamlined your structure, being able to tone that back down. And so everybody knows what they're doing, what their responsibility is, and keeping it clear. Because if it's not clear and you've got bylaws that say that somebody's responsible for something, when in practice they're not, there's going to be a conflict there. And that conflict just creates issues and concerns. And then that's when you're paying me or another attorney a lot of money to clean it up. And it would be a lot simpler to address it first.
That's right. That's true. Now we know any organization typically has a moral and a fiduciary responsibility, and churches are no different. And you advise nonprofit boards regarding fiduciary duties.
Yes.
Okay, for the pastor or board member who may be watching this, who may not be familiar with that terminology, what are fiduciary duties and why should church leaders understand them?
So fiduciary duties are the highest level of responsibility imposed by the law. And they're in nonprofit organizations and churches. They're imposed on the board of directors, officers, and any other senior leaders. And there's not a true definition across state lines, but they can generally be summarized as the duty of care, which is if you're a board member, you know what the organization is doing. You've read board reports, you've read financial statements, you know what's going on in the organization, and you're showing up to board meetings knowledgeable and prepared, and you're participating. You're not
Okay.
just showing up, listening to the senior pastor come in and say, here's what we've got here over the last quarter, last year, whenever your last board meeting was, here's where we want to go, and giving him the rubber stamp. You're asking
Right.
questions. You're not being contentious just for contentious sake, but you're asking
Right.
questions. You're saying, what is this? How is this going to help further our mission? What is this going to cost us if we do this rather than that?
Right. Right.
What's better in this realm or that realm? Thinking through different things, and as a board, working together to try to think through everything and come to the best decision. That's the duty of care. You've also got the duty of loyalty, which is acting in the organization's best interest rather than your own. So if your church needs the parking lot repaved, and I'm on the board and I own a paving company, and I, going through and making sure that if they hire me, which they could, but that it's not creating a conflict of interest, or it's not creating any unreasonable private benefit for me.
Right. Right.
So ensuring that we're always acting in the organization's best interest. And then you've got the duty of obedience, which is every action that I'm taking as a leader furthering the organization's mission. So if I'm at a church, are we staying faithful to our mission of, loving God and loving others, or whatever your specific mission is? Right. Or are we diving into programs that are maybe more social or more drifting away from that mission, whatever it may be?
Okay.
So that's your duty of obedience, because everything you do has to be in furtherance of the organization's mission. So that's a summary of the fiduciary duties, and each individual leader is held responsible for completing those.
Matthew, thank you, man. You unpacked that thing. Thank you for that. You know what? I think you got a future in this. So, now let's talk about policies that protect people in the ministry. Okay. Now at Faith Secure, one of the things I frequently encounter this during church security assessments is that churches may have established practices, but very little written policy. Yeah. So from a legal and governance perspective, I want you to just unpack the difference between this is how we've always done it and having an established written policy.
Yeah, and I think there's not necessarily anything inherently wrong about having a process that's not documented. Right. The hard part of when it's not documented is enforcing it consistently. So when you say you've got a new volunteer that shows up, and I'm going to use child protection, for example, you've got a new volunteer signs up to work in the elementary class at your church. Mm-hmm. You've got certain procedures that you've got to ensure the kids' safety, to ensure that the class is running well, that, the kids are learning and all of that. And that person is going to need something to learn those procedures. They're either going to learn it slowly by watching others, or you can give them the policy in writing that will help them understand it. And ideally, you're going to train on that policy as well. But giving them it in writing establishes what they're supposed to do in advance, rather than having to have them learn it over time. And it just helps the organization overall to work along those same procedures, because if it's not written down, my understanding of what we're supposed to do in a certain situation might be slightly different than your understanding, which might be slightly different than the next person's understanding. And that creates inconsistencies. And it's those inconsistencies where things slip through the cracks, where you're not maybe practicing best practices. You've got kind of a good thing, but not the best. Or you have two options that are both good, and leadership has chosen one over the other, but that's not clearly communicated. So having it in writing helps establish that, helps train people, and it helps keep things consistent.
All right. Now, Matthew, I want to get to a topic that's very important to me, and I want to spend some time on it, okay? I want to talk about children, youth, and vulnerable populations, okay? Mm-hmm. One area where stakes are especially high is the children's and youth ministry. Yeah. What legal and governance responsibilities should church leaders understand when they're developing child protection policies?
Yeah, man, I think, like you said, working with children is such a high responsibility.
Yes.
And just in the last 10 years or so, we've learned so much about the risks and the harm that can come to children from poor procedures, not protecting them, things like that. And I think as from a legal and risk perspective, we know that we are responsible for stewarding these kids and for training them, to keeping them safe. And so implementing a very holistic child protection structure and system and even culture within the church is imperative now, because now the public knows that these risks are out there. The courts know that these risks are out there. And nonprofit leaders have no excuse for not understanding that these risks are out there and that they happen in our churches. And so you can't claim ignorance anymore. You have to say, this is something that happens and I need to address it.
Right.
So understanding where those threats are and understanding the best practices to kind of prevent those threats, ideally, and how those best practices apply to your church. And that might look slightly different, depending on whether you're a large church or you're a small church, rural versus urban, things like that. And so understanding that, implementing the best practices, screening your volunteers is huge, and implementing procedures and check-ins and training so that everybody's on the same page.
And you mentioned the thing I'm going to pivot right into about screenings. Where do background checks fit into a broader child protection strategy? And I got another part to it. And why shouldn't a church assume that conducting background checks alone means it has adequately addressed the risk?
I think your second question kind of leads into my answer, but background checks are a critical part of volunteer screening. They should be done on every volunteer, especially those that work with kids, but I would say even every volunteer that at the church.
Right.
And on the flip side, they're not the entire volunteer screening process.
Right.
There are a lot of gaps that come with background checks, because background checks only show convictions. They don't show whether or not somebody's been charged with a crime, typically. They don't show anytime there's been an allegation, but no charges filed. They don't show any time that somebody's done something wrong, but it's hidden, it's secret, no one knows. And so a lot of times, especially for repeat offenders, somebody will find out that somebody was harming a child, and it'll come out that this is the 12th, the 15th, the 20th kid that they've harmed. So we don't know that that's been happening, and the background check's not going to show it. And even if other issues, like if there's been a DCFS report of abuse to a child, those are all confidential. They're not going to show up on a background check. So things like that kind of show the limits of a background check. If this person has a criminal conviction, is on the sex offender registration database or something like that, that's always going to flag. That's obviously a no. But it's those other situations that aren't going to show up on the background check, where you need an application asking about their background, asking about their reasons for wanting to serve, and other different things like that. The application should ask for references, and you should call those references.
Yes, right.
I'd say talk to them on the phone, talk to them in person if you can, read their body language. Video call works as well, because you can talk to them. A lot of times you'll ask them a question and they'll go, the answer will be, yeah, this person's fine, but their body is saying, maybe not,
Maybe not.
Realizing those signs, and doing that in a conversation rather than in writing, because a person is a lot more likely to be open and honest in a conversation rather than in an email.
Absolutely.
And you're going to get a lot better information. And one question that I'd say to ask is, would you trust this person with your children? And so, you can get a lot of insight into those types of reference checks that wouldn't show up on a background check. They're not going to show up on an application, but kind of a little bit of a peek behind the curtain there.
Right.
For churches, I would recommend a waiting period as well. You're not going to have someone come out on a Sunday, say, I want to work in your kids ministry, and put them in the class the next week.
Right.
Give them 6 months, give them 12 months in the church, because unfortunately churches are seen as easy targets.
That's right.
For working with kids, because a lot of churches need volunteers. Just last Sunday, my church said, hey, we need more volunteers for the fall programs. And so it's easy for people to just get plugged right in.
Right.
For new people in the church, if you can wait 6 months, you can wait 12 months to show that they're consistent. It makes it a lot harder for people who are just trying to get access to kids. And it shows their heart. It encourages them to get involved in the church. There's a lot of benefit for that kind of waiting period as well. And then I would conclude the screening with an interview with the applicant, with the potential volunteer, because then you can clarify if the references had anything that you might want to double check on, if the application raised some questions that you want a little bit of clarification on. That's your way of sitting down with them, getting a vibe check with them. Is this guy, one that I want to serve with my kids, and clarifying anything that may come up through the application process. It may just be that, this said one thing, that said another thing. It can be easily reconciled, or you've got some deeper questions that you need to delve into. But that is just an extra step in that screening process that gives you a more holistic picture than just a background check does.
Man, I like that. And, and you mentioned that basically background checks are a part of everything. They're not the end all. So now we talk about volunteer screening, but how important is not only volunteer screening, but supervision practices, reporting procedures, documentation, and training? How important are those for a holistic development of a volunteer to work in the children's area?
It's critical, because I've seen so many news stories, and I've worked with clients who have come back and we've asked, if they had an allegation and something happened, and volunteers start popping up as, oh, I noticed this little thing over here, but I didn't think anything of it because just this little piece doesn't raise any red flags.
Right.
But when you start putting all those pieces together, it paints a different picture.
Yeah.
And so, or on the flip side, you've got volunteers that said, I didn't realize that was grooming, or I didn't realize that was an early sign of abuse. So the training helps them identify those early signals. And so if those other volunteers are your biggest enforcers, so to speak.
Okay.
They're the ones that might be able to catch something that another volunteer is doing, or to say, hey, even in a completely innocent environment, reminding another volunteer saying, hey, this could create an opportunity, or it could look bad. We don't even want to have the appearance. So just reminding everybody and keeping everything in check there. And if there is a concern, you can raise it to the children's pastor or the other supervisor.
Right.
And if you raise a concern and enough people are raising enough concerns, the youth pastor or the children's pastor, whoever's in charge, can then put those pieces together, ideally before something happens. And encouraging that type of open communication and giving them the training and the knowledge to identify that early is probably one of your biggest defenses.
I love it. Okay, now we're going to switch over to contracts, facilities, and third parties, okay? Because I know a lot of people don't realize how many contracts churches, particularly larger churches, can enter into, from vendors and contractors to facility use agreements to special events. So what mistakes do you see churches make when entering into these types of agreements?
There's a couple broad ones, and you can get more specific within each of these, but I'd say not reviewing the contract beforehand, especially larger contracts. There's obviously going to be small ones. I'm thinking of like the small accounts that your online accounts that you're setting up to do different things. They're going to have the terms and agreements. You're not going to be able to negotiate those much, but at least understanding what you're getting yourself into there, because there could be some risk of like data protection and things like that you need to be aware of. But on the larger ones, review the agreement. Understand what your obligations are and make sure that what's on paper matches what you thought it was, because what's on paper is going to control. Make sure that if you need to end the relationship early for whatever reason, that there's appropriate ways to get out, and that it's not going to cost you an arm and a leg to do that. I know elevator service contracts are the worst for that. I've done a few of those trying to get people out. And so is there an easy way out, or at least a reasonable way out should needs change? Understanding indemnification, which is a big legal term that most people just glaze over at, but that is essentially the paragraph that describes who pays for what if something goes wrong.
Right.
And am I going to have to pay for everything that the other party has if anything in the world goes wrong? I may not want to do that.
Right.
And am I going to get reimbursed on my end if something goes wrong and I have expenses? And there's no one size fits all when it comes to those types of things. It varies heavily depending on what the subject matter of the agreement is. But a lot of churches don't even touch that paragraph. And so they could be opening themselves to large bills if something goes wrong. They could be paid for things like that, or they could be out of pocket if not get reimbursed on the other end. So just understanding all of those types of things, reviewing them, and then once it's signed, managing them? Are we, if it's a contract over time, are we fulfilling our responsibilities?
Right.
Are we, is the other side fulfilling their responsibilities? If we want, if there's, it ends and we want to renew, what are the renewal requirements 5 years
Right.
down the line, 10 years down the line, whatever that termination is? And are you anticipating that, thinking through it in advance before, oh, I've got to make a decision by Monday, or do we want to keep doing this, or do we need to change it? So having some sort of system in place, some person who's responsible to manage those, at least, especially the higher level ones, and understanding that both sides are doing what they need to do.
Okay, and on that vein, Matthew, I'm going to throw you an alley-oop, okay? When should a church have an attorney review an agreement rather than relying on a template found online or simply signing what a vendor provides?
The answer I want to give everybody is every single time.
Okay,
and
right.
Before it's signed, early on in negotiations, if possible, because then we can advise on what's reasonable, what's not reasonable, things like that. But I understand that churches don't have the resources to do every single little contract.
Right.
And so ideally getting us in as early as possible, and especially on the bigger items. And that a lot of that comes down to what the organization's comfortable with. If they've done a ton of these similar types of contracts before, then they might have an understanding to be able to do it on their own. If not, I would say at least get somebody in to kind of answer questions, work in the background, and advise you, educate the church leader on what to do next. It can be a light touch. It doesn't have to be a full contract review and negotiation, but at least having, here's what we're thinking. What are your thoughts? And that can be a really quick call. It should be a thorough call, that we're going to need to talk through all of the facts and the circumstances related to that contract, but at least it can provide some guidance and potentially avoid some roadblocks down the road. And then as far as templates, I hate templates. Because
you and I talked offline about that, but yeah, go ahead.
Unfortunately, templates are written for the average, and there's always going to be something in there that doesn't apply. And so knowing what that is, and you can start with a document, but understanding how to refine that document and how to further develop it to fit the needs of your organization is critical. Because if you're a membership church, you have members with a lot of rights to vote on elders, directors, whatever you call them, the budget, on the pastor, on committee assignments, that varies on what members can vote on depending on the church.
Okay.
But you download one that has very limited membership rights or no membership rights at all. You have members in name only kind of thing.
Okay.
That's going to be a completely different bylaws, so to speak, than what you may need. On the flip side, for contracts or things like that, or even policies, I know there's a lot of policies that a lot of churches download, or employee handbooks or things like that. That's going to look a lot different. Especially for employee handbooks, your state is going to have a lot different requirements than the state next door. And so making sure that you're legally compliant, that it fits the organization, and that any edits you make are maintaining the consistency within the document.
Right.
Because you may change one thing, recognizing that it's wrong, but there's another thing that said it somewhere else, and now it's saying two different things. And you've got two people looking at two different sections going, what's going on here? So for that reason, you can start with a document, but it needs to be revised. Don't just slap your name on a template and use that.
Okay, that's some great advice right there. Now, one of the main things that we trumpet here at Faith Secure is leadership. So I have a question for you that gets to the heart of the Faith Secure philosophy. At what point does legal preparedness stop being an attorney's responsibility and becomes a leadership responsibility?
Day one. It's day one. Legal preparedness is part of the fiduciary duties, and it's a part of stewarding the church or the nonprofit. And that, at the end of the day, it's going to come down to the leader, the director, the officer, the senior pastor. Anyone in senior leadership has that responsibility. And it's great to go out and get advice from an attorney, from others. and depending on the subject matter that you're asking about. But at the end of the day, it comes down to the leader stewarding the organization well and making sure that it's set up to operate as best as it can for as long as it can.
Okay. Well, now, Matthew, I also have a faith secure question for you. Okay. Now, just imagine you could sit down with the leadership team of every church in America, right? Okay. What would be 3 legal or governance issues that you would have them address before they become crises, and why?
I think first I would start out with just the core, and that's your governing documents, your articles of incorporation, your bylaws, and your key policies. And then the key policies may change based on what the organization does. But things like a conflict of interest policy, with your duty of loyalty, making sure that everything is above board, both legally and in the eyes of the public.
Right.
But just making sure that core is secure and that it's set up well, and that you're operating by it, because everything emanates from that.
Okay.
So those governance issues, that the board meetings, the bylaw compliance, that everything there is working well. After that, I think it could devolve based on what the organization does. For churches, I would say child protection policies would be high up there, like we've discussed, because it's so critical. Every church works with children, even if they're just coming to your services, they're there.
They're there.
So having that understanding there is critical, and the harm that can come from not doing it is so great. I think we're still kind of revealing all the different levels of harm that come when we don't abide by our responsibilities to protect kids.
Right.
And the third, I think, is a little more proactive, but it's just getting your systems and your operations in line to work efficiently, and making sure your compliance matters are taken care of, making sure that any other benefits that you may be able to get are taken advantage of. I'm thinking of, here in Illinois, we have high property taxes. And so churches and other organizations that could qualify for exemption from those property taxes may not have that. And so they could be paying $3,000, $5,000, $10,000 a year that they don't have to, that they could be then putting back into the ministry and using it for their programs. So taking advantage of things like that, and it's hard to say generally because it's very fact specific, but making sure that those types of proactive steps are taken to align the organization for success.
All right. Okay. Outstanding. For those pastors and church leaders that are listening, make sure you're paying attention. Matthew's dropping some knowledge here. Okay. Before we get to the closing question, I like to do what's called the lightning round. Okay. So I'm going to give you a word or a phrase. I just want you to give me the first thought that comes to your mind. Okay. All right. You touched on it earlier, but let's start with bylaws.
I think that's the core. It's one of the core of your organization.
All right. Documentation.
Documentation, I would say, it's evidence. One, I'm an attorney, so I'm going to think evidence, but it's also evidence for your organization of where do we need to make some fine tune some things, what might we be doing wrong, different things like that.
Okay. Background checks.
Important, but not everything.
Okay. Contracts.
Clarity is kindness on those. And I would say making sure it's clear. If everybody understands their responsibility, then you're good.
All right. Volunteers.
Ooh, volunteers. That brings to mind a quote from Jesse Cole and the Savannah Bananas. I'm going to adjust it slightly to fit the nonprofit context, but it's love your participants more than your programs.
Okay.
And love your people, that is to say your staff and your volunteers, more than you love your participants, because your staff and your volunteers are the ones who are giving of their time, the volunteers freely, to serve your organization. So if you're taking care of them, they'll take care of your people and your programs.
That's right. Okay. Governance.
Stewardship.
All right. Risk management.
I think of risk management as a 5-point harness. it's got to be more than one thing. And when you have all five or whatever the number is, you're well protected.
Okay. And lastly, preparedness.
Preparedness. I mean, it's always the goal, and it's something that you probably always have to keep maintaining.
All right. All right. And here's the closing question, Matthew. Now, you said that your goal isn't simply to solve legal problems after they arise, but to help nonprofit leaders build healthy organizations and manage risk wisely.
Mm-hmm.
For the pastor or church leader that's watching this episode, they realize that there are probably some things that we need to get in order. What is the very first step you would encourage them to take?
I'd say it starts with taking inventory. Every church, every nonprofit's different. What you're doing well is going to be different than what another church is doing well, and what you're doing not as well is going to be different than what another church is. So taking inventory, identifying the gaps, and I'd say start by making a corporate notebook if you don't have one already. Right. And that's going to be a place where you're holding all your governance documents, your articles of incorporation, your bylaws, your policies. If you have a determination letter from the IRS, which churches can get, they don't need one. You have that. You've got any real estate related documents, your deed, your lease, anything, any third party facility use agreements. You've got different employee handbooks. You've got basically any core governing documents should live in that corporate notebook. Board meeting minutes for both your board and your committees, things like that, and resolutions as well. And piecing that all together will help you identify where you're doing well and where you might have gaps on. At least they'll create a good resource, because a lot of times you're going to need those documents later on. So you'll know where they are. It's not going to be, where did we save that? Was it on?
Right.
And so it's a good solid step to both, one, keep your governance documents in one location, and two, identify any weaknesses. And then once you identify those weaknesses, create a game plan. Right. And I know I like to come alongside churches especially, and they might say, we've got these 4 or 5 areas that we need to address. Okay. And we don't know which one to do first. We don't have the money to do all of them right now, which is a common thing I see. I like to come alongside them and say, topic A is definitely your first priority. We should do that right now, because there's a lot of risk. It could be really bad moving forward, and it's really important. Topic B, you should do now if we can. But if you need to wait 6-12 months, we can do that later. Okay. Topics C and D, they're important, but they're more kind of proactive. We can wait on those if we need to. Topic E would be great if we could do it later on, but if you're not in a position to, we can hold off on that one. Okay. And then, helping them understand what the general costs of those might be, and then creating a game plan that helps their board implement that into their strategic planning moving forward. So they can say, over the next 3 years, here's our legal strategic plan, and we're going to update these areas as they come. And we always try to leave a little bit of buffer for the things that come up unexpectedly.
Always unexpected.
Always do it. Pray for the best, prepare for the worst.
There you go.
So helping them understand that way, it's not a crisis to crisis type thing. It's taking some more of those proactive steps. You can budget for it, you can prepare for it, and you can move forward.
Matthew, thank you for joining us and for helping church leaders understand that protecting the mission requires more than just responding to threats and crises. You've pointed out that it requires good governance, sound policies, responsible decision-making, and the willingness to address those vulnerabilities before they become crises. So before we close, please tell our audience how they can learn more about you and your work. How can they get in touch with you?
Yeah, LinkedIn is where I'm the most active online. So you can connect with me there. I'm trying to consistently share different ideas, different tips, different insights, things like that. So connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm also, I post regularly on Substack, try to do it every couple weeks or so with a more long form article, with more practical guidance, things to think through. And Substack's great because it sends it straight to your email. So you don't have to try to hunt for it. And then if you have any questions, you can reach out to me. My law firm's Bay and Mays, BEA, and then Mays, MAYS. So you can reach out to me. I'm happy to answer any questions or if you need any help.
Beautiful. I know you said a mouthful, but I want you to repeat that contact information one more time to make sure they get it.
LinkedIn, Matthew Brown, Substack. You can find links on my LinkedIn. That's probably the easiest way to get to it. And then you can reach me via email. I'll just give you my email. It's M as in Matthew, my last name Brown at Bea, BEA, law, LAW.com.
Beautiful. Matthew, thank you for being on the podcast, man. I really appreciate it. You shared some very important knowledge, and it's something that's often overlooked by churches. So thank you for being on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I enjoyed our conversation.
No problem. Just stick around for 1 second while I close. And to everyone that's watching, remember, being prepared isn't about operating in fear. It's about exercising good stewardship over the people, property, and resources that God has entrusted to us. If you found the information on this program to be insightful, please like, share, and subscribe. Until next time, remember to remain watchful, prayerful, and prepared. God bless.